What happens when you lie to a dog? Researchers decided to find out. What they discovered suggested dogs don't simply forget being misled. They remember who did it. And they change how they respond the next time they see that person. But does that mean your dog actually knows you lied? Or is something else happening entirely? Here's where it starts. Dogs have been living alongside humans for somewhere between 15 and 40,000 years. Depending on which study you read. That is an enormous stretch of time during which dogs were not just surviving near people, they were depending on them, reading them, learning to anticipate what humans would do next. The result is an animal whose social intelligence around human behavior is genuinely remarkable. Dogs track human gaze direction with a precision that most primates cannot match. They follow pointing gestures. They notice when attention is directed at them versus away from them. They have essentially been running a continuous analysis of human communicative behavior for thousands of generations, which makes the question of whether they detect dishonesty a lot less surprising than it sounds at first. The foundational study on this came from researchers testing what happens when a human repeatedly provides dogs with inaccurate information. The setup was relatively straightforward. A person would indicate where food was hidden. The dog would look. In some conditions, the person was consistently accurate. In others, the person pointed toward empty containers, misdirecting the dog deliberately. What happened next is the part that matters. Dogs who had been misled by a human informant stopped following that person's gestures. Not immediately, and not completely, but the trust eroded at a measurable rate. They would still engage with other humans in the room. They would still follow gestures from strangers they had never met before, but the specific individual who had given them false information lost credibility. The dog had essentially updated its assessment of that person and was treating them as an unreliable source. Now, here is the distinction that makes this genuinely interesting rather than mildly impressive. There are two possible explanations for that behavior. The first is simple pattern recognition. The dog learned that following this person's pointing led to no food, so it stopped following the pointing. That is a basic associative learning outcome and does not require anything remotely complex happening cognitively. The second explanation is more significant. The dog recognized something about the person's intent, not just the outcome. It noticed that this person knew where the food was and deliberately directed attention elsewhere. That is a meaningfully different cognitive operation. The first explanation requires only learning. The second requires something closer to a model of another individual's mental state. The research that pushes toward the second explanation comes from studies looking at how dogs respond to different kinds of misinformation. When the person giving false information appeared to be genuinely confused, operating on wrong information themselves, dogs treated that situation differently than when the person clearly knew the correct location and still pointed elsewhere. Dogs seem to distinguish between someone who was wrong and someone who was deliberately misleading them. That distinction is not trivial. It is exactly the kind of distinction that requires reading intention rather than just outcome. There's a concept in cognitive science called theory of mind, which is the capacity to model what another individual believes, knows, or intends, including when that belief differs from reality. For a long time, the scientific consensus held that this ability was essentially unique to humans, and possibly a few great apes under very specific conditions. Dogs were not considered candidates for anything approaching this level of sophistication. That consensus has been under significant pressure for years now, and the research on deception detection is one of the reasons why. What dogs appear to do is something researchers sometimes call selective trust calibration. They do not simply divide humans into trustworthy and untrustworthy categories and leave it there. The trust assessment appears to be individual-specific, context-sensitive, and capable of being updated over time. A dog that has been misled in one context does not necessarily become globally suspicious of all humans. The skepticism targets the specific individual who provided the false information. That level of precision is not consistent with a simple learned aversion. It looks more like a maintained social record. Dogs also show sensitivity to whether a human can see where the food is before giving information. In studies where a person provided guidance while visibly unable to see the relevant containers, dogs responded differently than when the same person had clear visual access to the information before misdirecting them. That is a sophisticated piece of inference. The dog is not just tracking what the human said, it's factoring in what the human could have known before they said it. The brain architecture supporting this is worth understanding. Dogs have a region called the temporal cortex that shows heightened activity when processing human faces, voices, and communicative signals. Neuroimaging studies have shown that dogs process human emotional tone and facial expression using brain areas that correspond to social and emotional processing regions in the human brain. The equipment for reading human intent is not absent in dogs. It has been shaped by thousands of years of selection pressure in exactly the kind of environment where detecting dishonesty would be useful. There's also the behavioral evidence that comes from everyday observation, which researchers have been more careful about formalizing. Dogs regularly show what looks like skepticism toward humans who have previously behaved unreliably. They hesitate. They look between the person and the location they are being directed toward. They sometimes look directly at the human's face in a way that appears to be checking rather than just waiting for permission to move. Whether that constitutes awareness of lying in any rich sense is genuinely uncertain, but it is not nothing. The honest answer to the question this video started with is that dogs almost certainly detect something when a human provides deliberately false information. Whether that something rises to the level of catching a lie the way you and I catch a lie, with a felt sense of betrayal and a model of the other person's deceptive intent, remains genuinely unresolved. The behavioral data is real and it is replicable. The inner experience behind that behavior is the part science cannot yet reach. What the research makes clear is that your dog is not operating on blind faith when it interacts with you. It's running a continuous assessment of your reliability. It notices inconsistencies. It remembers them individually. And the trust you have with your dog is something you can genuinely erode, not through training failures or harsh handling alone, but through being repeatedly inconsistent with what you signal versus what is actually true. The next time you point your dog towards something that's not there, remember that you are not dealing with a creature that simply forgets and moves on. You're dealing with an animal that has been reading humans longer than recorded history, and it is very, very good at its job. If this one changed how you think about your dog, subscribe and stick around. There's more where this came